Welcome back, everybody. Repetition and rhythm is the next set of principles that we want to work with, interrelated principles that we want to get to know. Repetition is a regular occurrence of visual elements. Repetition can contribute greatly to unity, to continuity between elements, to the flow of the eye through a design, as well as to emphasis. Pattern is a different kind of, a specific kind of repetition. It refers to an all-over design created by the repetitive ordering of elements. Patterning is a common design strategy in many of the world's textiles art traditions. In Afghanistan, the weavers have for centuries made carpets that include imagery from their lives. So before and during the Afghan War from 2001 to 2021, weavers included imagery of war in their carpets, repeated in patterns which followed the traditional practice of weaving. So in this rug, inside the rectangular border, which is itself a pattern, the weaver embedded repeated images of helicopters, hand grenades, and also automobiles. Each of these items takes form in the carpet as a memorized sequence of stitches. This becomes a pattern that the weaver varies slightly in color. Okay? Rhythm is any sequence of dominant and subordinate elements. So again, here I find it helpful to think about music and rhythm and the different beats and rhythms and how they're spaced in a piece of music. So rhythm refers to any sequence, right? But it depends on there being some dominance and some subordinates within that repetition. So Ogata Korin's cranes from the Japanese Edo period is a really good example where we have this grouping or apparent grouping of cranes, right? He's using this principle of rhythm not only to organize the subject matter, but also as an expressive device. So the simplest way to create a sense of rhythm is by repetition. So looking at this image, which is actually one of a pair of folding screens, the birds are super simplified. Their bodies and legs, they form a shape with repeated variations. So some of them have a little bit more of a bend to the neck. Some of them are leaning forward. Some of them have their legs spread a little bit farther apart. Notice how the heads and the eyes are all in different positions in height, and how just kind of tracking those related elements takes you through a certain sequence of high-low rhythm visually in the image. Diagonal force, very strong from the leading the eye to, ironically, an empty section of the composition, which the authors of your textbook find humorous, right? So there's such a strong movement in this direction, and then by the time we get there, it's empty, right? The heads are held high, and their location near the top of the composition also enhances a sense of loftiness in a way, giving them a kind of personality. The rhythmic procession, the marching steps in a seemingly straight line, it almost feels like there's something somewhat quirky or humorous about that, almost like an animation might work, right? A sequence of movement happening there. The background is flat, but it's also very opulent. The gold leaf is interrupted only by a suggestion of the curving stream at the right. So when I think about rhythm and looking at this image, I think about the pace that is created by the different groupings. So look at it for a minute, and in your head or out loud, wherever you are, either is okay. Think about a rhythm like dun, da da dum, da dum, right? Created by larger numbers clustered together, two, and then larger spaces, right? Notice how the spaces change from right to left, moving in this direction, large negative space, medium negative space, small negative space. So those subtle differentiations and those subtle spacings, those grouping differences, it is a dominant and subordinate that creates this rhythm moving across. In addition to the subject matter, walking, we associate with a rhythmic quality as well. Okay. So scale and proportion is another way to organize information and or elements in a design. Scale, we want to understand the difference between the two. Scale is really the size relationship of one thing to another thing of the same thing. So it can be seen as an idea that we have that is relative to the normal or the standard size of something. We imagine normal based on our prior experience or on our prior knowledge of that thing. Scale is one of the first decisions that an artist makes when planning a work of art. How big will it be? How big of a painting? Will it be a miniature? Will it be a monument, right? We experience scale in relationship to our own size. So things that are larger than ourselves, either actual or depicted, tend to induce a feeling of wonder, awe, maybe even fear. By contrast, things that are smaller in scale can seem more approachable, for example, or more pleasing. Some people say that small scale means a kind of intimate experience with it, a close-up experience of the thing. I think either way, whether we think of large equated with fear and dominance, and small equated with intimacy and preciousness, I think those are just generalities, and that it really depends on what the work is about. When we start to interpret how to scale is a decision that contributes to the meaning of the work, right? So artists sometimes play with our expectations of normal sizes. It's one part of the range of expression. And many artists in the 20th century have distorted scale for visual effect. So we're looking at one of the smallest works ever created, Crucero do Sul, Southern Cross, by Cildo Mireles, 1969 to 1970. It's a tiny wooden cube. And if you look closely at it, you can see that it's actually two halves. One half was made from pine, the other half from oak, and the two pieces were neatly glued together and sanded. It's a sugar lump size cube, and it has to be exhibited according to the artist's preferences. It has to be exhibited directly on the floor and should ideally be displayed on its own in a large room. It's usually reproduced in larger than life close-ups, balancing precariously on one of Mireles' fingertips, which is what we see here, right? So just think about the difference between the artist's intention for the display of this work versus the way we typically see it if we can't access a museum, for example, or a space where this work is exhibited. So Southern Cross is a minimalist sculpture. So we come back to that term again, which is really about reducing something down to its simplest statement, to its simplest essence. This feels almost like Lilliputian in scale, right? Gulliver's Travels. Any fans of Gulliver's Travels out there? Mireles calls this an example of humiliminimalism, a humble brand of minimalism. From his father and from an uncle who lived deep in the forest, Mireles learned of the native Tupi tribe's belief that oak and pine are sacred trees, and that fire was first discovered by rubbing together these two woods, with the softer pine bursting into flames. The artist made it to comment on the lack of importance that most people attribute to Southern Hemisphere countries, which produce many natural products, such as lumber. The work is so small in scale that exhibiting it is a challenge because most viewers miss it, just as many skip the news coming in from Brazil. So the small scale of this work serves the artist's intent as a comment on common attitudes towards his country. But on another note, Klaus Oldenburg and Cozy van Bruggen use scale to distort things in an opposite kind of way, more of a humorous kind of approach. And there is a breakout in the textbook, so be sure that you check that out for more information on this artistic duo. In shuttlecocks, the artist arrayed 4 huge metal shuttlecocks on the lawns outside the north and south facades of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Museum of Art in Kansas City, Missouri. So a shuttlecock, for those of you who don't know, is used in badminton. It's like a game toy type that you bat back and forth, right? So each shuttlecock is 18 feet high and weighs over 5,000 pounds compared to the little plastic thing that flies through the air when you hit it, right? Okay, so really playing with our associations of a familiar thing, outlandish scale. right? Because badminton is played on grass, it appears that the shuttlecocks fell during a game between two giants who used the museum as a net, right? So we see a real sense of humor here. It uses shuttlecocks as an artwork that uses distortion of scale to poke fun at the museum, a rather gentle kind of fun, mocking its rather prim look with a playfully irreverent attitude. It was actually not very popular at first, resisted by many, because the frivolousness of it, what seemed like something frivolous or light, was felt to be out of keeping with the purpose of the museum. The city's principal newspaper even had an editorial against it. Members of the board of the city Department of Parks and Recreation, which controls the land, tried to block it, but museum curators received hate mail. Yet it's still there today and much beloved. Proportion is different from scale. Proportion relates to the size, proportion is the size relationship of parts to a whole. So a change in proportion can make a major difference in how we experience a given subject. This becomes apparent when we compare these two pietas, pietà meaning pity in Italian, and it refers to a depiction of Mary holding and mourning over the body of Jesus. So creating a believable composition with a fully grown man lying on his mother's lap is challenging, and that's the challenge that Michelangelo took on in his Pietà from 1498 and 1500. In his most famous work, Michelangelo addressed the problem by dramatically altering Mary's proportions. He made the heads of the two figures the same size, but greatly enlarged Mary's body in relationship to that of Christ, although we can't really see it because he disguised the massiveness of the size of her body with deep folds of drapery. Her seated figure spreads out to support the almost horizontal curve of Christ's limp body. So if you look closely, you can see the two knees underneath his legs and underneath his torso, and the drapery swinging back and forth between the two. So we feel the presence of Mary, but we don't get thrown off by the massive scale that her figure actually is. Imagine how Mary would appear if she were standing. Michelangelo made Mary's body into that of a giant. If she were a living human being rather than a work of art, she would stand about 8 feet tall. Because the proportions of the figure of Christ are anatomically correct, and there are a lot of really beautiful naturalistic anatomic details, we really overlook the proportions of Mary's figure, yet the distortion is essential to the way that we experience the content of the work. We feel the massiveness of that grief, the massiveness of the action of holding him. And yet she doesn't feel obviously overtly massive to us. It's almost as though the scale emphasizes the emotion of that moment in that relationship between the two of them. So with that in mind, we'll take a look at the Röntgen Pietà from 1300 to 1325. It's about 2 centuries earlier than Michelangelo, and unlike the Renaissance work, this German sculpture carved both figures of similar height. So if they were both to stand up, they would be about the same size. But the choice of making Christ seem bony and emaciated helped to alleviate the problem of how Mary could possibly physically support a person of a similar size. Christ's gaunt body also expresses the truth of his suffering in a way that Michelangelo avoided, actually. The anonymous creator of this Pietà carved both heads larger, out of proportion to the sizes of their bodies. And these distortions help to heighten the expressive content of the work. So for this break, a question of scale. Okay. Just so that we get clear, what are the main differences between the terms scale and proportion? So just to clarify and really cement the definition in our heads. And then to apply that, use any work of art from any chapter of the book, or you can go back to the Metropolitan Museum Art Image Database, select 1 or 2 works of art. And so for your discussion during this break, In what ways, if any, is the artist using scale to add to the meaning of the work that you chose? If the work were a miniature, such as Morella's Southern Cross, right, how would that change the possible interpretations of that work or the experience of that work for the viewer? So we're looking at one work and we're asking two questions of it. Well, three really. One, is scale a part of the importance of the work right now? Whether it is or not, can you imagine shifting the scale of the example that you've chosen? Make it a monument, make it a miniature. If you did either of those two things, how would it change your experience of the work? How would it change your understanding of the meaning of the work? How would it change your interpretation? Okay, food for thought. We'll be back soon.